Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And, last year was the first time I had an opportunity to go to Israel. And it was such an incredible experience because, as a student of the Bible, to actually be in the place where so many events occurred that were so noteworthy. But what really impressed me was the fact that the people, absolutely surrounded by all kinds of horrors, refused to allow their lives to be dictated by terrorism. And I think it's a wonderful example for us here in America. I normally am a spontaneous speaker, but I want to make sure I get all my points in today, so I will actually be using a script. It might be the first time anybody's ever seen me doing that, but I don't want to miss any of the points that I really wanted to make. After serving for 2 terms as the first president of a new nation, born from the ashes of European colony, George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, warned the citizens of the United States that it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Now, Washington, of course, was concerned about the constant changing and realignments of various countries and empires in Europe and what that would mean for the United States. Now, if we fast forward to 2015, I'd like to call your attention to a passage by Ambassador Oren, Israel's most recent former ambassador to the United States. He recently wrote a book that looks at the relationship between the United States and Israel. And I was taken by the paragraph early in the foreword of the book describing why he entitled the book Ally. Ambassador Oren wrote the following: "Ally is a simple, beautiful word. It evokes warmth, indeed fraternity, and its meaning is invariably positive. One may be a partner, but never an ally in crime. Allies, Hebrew counterpart, is even simpler and more stirring. Ben Britt, literally the son of the covenant, recalls the circumcision rite, and beyond that, the Jewish people's special relationship with God. Fittingly, a special relationship is said to exist between Israel and the United States, and like its biblical precedent, that Brit is both physical and eternal. Any American president or candidate for president formulating policies toward Israel will be well served to look back at what makes the relationship between the United States and Israel so special and eternal. And if we examine history properly, it is easy to see that the special bond between these two nations existed well before either country existed as a country. We should look back to the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. And even before our founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia and decided to change the course of human history, the first settlers founded towns in this land with names like Bethlehem and Zion. They, in fact, saw the New World as the new promised land and a land of religious freedom. It is interesting to note that the first committee that was established to decide on the coat of arms for the newly formed nation had amongst its members 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. These members of the committee were asked to deliver their ideals independently for the seal of the new nation. In an amazing coincidence, the 3 members of the committee all submitted the same images of the Jewish exodus from Egypt. For these 3 founding fathers, no image better represented the ideal of freedom on which the United States was founded. Could you imagine President Obama standing today in the White House press room with an image of Moses and Jewish people in front of him? Throughout our history, American presidents have had a special view of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, even well before Israel existed. John Quincy Adams said, "I believe in the rebuilding of Judea as an independent nation," and Abraham Lincoln referred to Palestine as the national home of the Jews, said this was a noble dream. and one shared by many Americans. Very few countries started out as democracies. Most of them evolved into democracies. Israel, however, was born a democracy and has stayed that way with fundamental tenets of democracy ever since. Now compare that to its neighbors. Many countries in the Middle East claim to be democracies, but I would put forth that elections won with 99% of the vote going to one candidate, or elections won under the shadow of dictatorships are not democratic. Regrettably, while Israel was born as a democracy, it was also born into a state of war that has remained in one form or another ever since May of 1948. Besides having fought the War of Independence in 1948, the War of Attrition in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the war in Lebanon in 1982, and the two Gaza wars in 2007, and again last year in 2014, Israel has also been under the constant threat of tens of thousands of missiles from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, faced two intifadas, and a nonstop threat of Islamic terrorism. Now, what is really sad is that all of this could have been avoided because UN Resolution 181, passed in November of 1947, called for the end of the British Mandate and a true partition plan for Palestine. Partition plan calls for the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state. The plan was accepted by the Jews but rejected by the Arabs, and hence the ever-present state of war. Ariel Sharon, in one of his most famous speeches, became the first Israeli prime minister to openly acknowledge and call for the two-state solution. Prime Ministers Ehud Olmert and Benjamin Netanyahu have subsequently joined him in publicly calling for a two-state solution. And while I'm not here today to debate a one-state or two-state solution, it is something, I think, for the Israeli leadership to decide. But it amazes me that the United Nations, the European Union, the Israeli government, and even the Palestinian Authority are all pushing for a solution that the Arabs themselves rejected in 1947. Imagine how much blood could have been saved had the Arabs agreed 68 years ago to exactly what they want to try to achieve today. The role of the United States today should not be to force peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but rather to help enable an environment in which peace can be forged. And the next president of the United States should start with a focus on supporting Israel in its efforts to find a lasting peace. The key word here is lasting. For too long, as I've followed the efforts by the United States and Europe to get the Israelis and Palestinians to agree to a peace deal, the focus has always been on what the future of the Palestinian state looks like. As president, my focus, first and foremost, would be to frame the debate as to what the future Israeli state would look like. After all, the goal of a lasting peace is not merely to give the Palestinians a state of their own and right to self-determination, but also to ensure that the state of Israel remains a Jewish state for the Jewish people forever. Before I go into more detail about that, let's just focus for a moment on the issues of a Palestinian state. One of the main problems, as I see it currently, is that Palestinians are a people divided by territory and by ideology. We know that there's a geographic challenge in trying to unite Gaza and the West Bank. These territories are separated by a mere 25 miles, and between lie some major Israeli cities with large populations like Beersheba. Uniting these two territories would literally split the state of Israel in half. But beyond the territorial challenge, a much bigger challenge exists. The challenge is the split between Fatah and Hamas. Fatah and Hamas operate in a constant state of conflict. Fatah rules the West Bank, Hamas rules the Gaza Strip. These two groups are constantly arresting each other's political foes in their respective territories. They reportedly torture each other's cooperatives and are continually vying for the support of the Palestinian people. Part of the problem, of course, is that Fatah is largely a secular political movement, while Hamas is a deeply religious Islamic political movement. And while there have been many times in the past that the two groups tried to operate unity governments, this has always devolved into minor civil wars between the two. The bottom line is that even if the Israeli government today withdrew to the 1967 borders and gave up Jerusalem, there is no one Palestinian group representative of the Palestinian people that could ratify the agreement. Thus, no peace agreement can be reached until the Hamas-Fatah issue is resolved. But assuming for a moment that both the territorial issue between the West Bank and Gaza can be solved, as well as the internal conflict between Fatah and Hamas, then let's ask ourselves, what should the next U.S. president do to help preserve a viable Jewish state living within the terms of a lasting peace? Well, first and foremost, Jewish state must be Jewish. That may sound obvious, but if we look at the current international proposals for a two-state solution, as well as listen to the words of the Palestinian leadership, the two states to be created are first a uninational Palestinian state with no Jews living in it, and second, effectively a binational state, namely Israel, with a majority Jewish population and well over 20% Palestinian minority. One doesn't have to look too far into the future to see what the long-term outcome would be. Eventually, the Jewish state would lose its Jewish identity, and Palestinian birth rates continue to eclipse that of Jewish population. This would lead to a uninational Palestinian state eventually taking over the binational Jewish state as the Palestinian population in Israel continued to grow. In addition to this threat, there is the geographical threat created by basing a two-state solution on the 1967 borders. Now, if this were to occur, the result would be an Israel with sections of the country less than 10 miles wide and partly bordered on the west by Gaza and the east by the West Bank. The distance from the border between Israel and the West Bank on the east to countries like Iraq and Iran would be measured in the hundreds of miles. This gives Israel an almost zero ability to defend herself practically from any sort of armored attack. Moreover, the 1967 borders will give back the high ground to Syria and the Golan Heights. This has numerous potentially fatal effects for Israel. First, it would allow any enemy to launch from Syria missiles to easily rain down on major Israeli population centers. With ISIS, the Iranians, and others currently operating in Syria, one can only think of the sheer havoc that would be created with any one of these groups positioned in the Golan Heights overlooking Israel. Second, it would give Syria the ability to either control or pollute Israel's only freshwater supply, the Sea of Galilee. Looking past these major territorial issues, there also remains the issue of Gaza acting as a conduit for Iranian-backed weapons. Much outrage has been leveled against Israel for blockading Gaza, but the only blockade that actually exists is the blockade of weapons and missiles that are immediately used to target Israeli citizens. The delivery of food, medicine, building supplies has not been blockaded by Israel. In fact, it is a reality that much of the building supplies allowed into Gaza was used to build the Hamas tunnels of terror to infiltrate Israel and commit acts of terror. And I actually had a chance to go into some of those tunnels when I was there last year, although we were carefully looking for people who might be trying to shoot us when we came out. I raise these issues again to say simply that we look forward to an American president and a policy put forth by that president that backs the wishes and desires of the Israeli people and their government. Second, that policy must ensure that Israel comes out of these negotiations as a Jewish state for generations to come. Franklin Roosevelt, one of our nation's most revered Democratic presidents, said so eloquently, "The American people, ever zealous in the cause of human freedom, have watched with sympathetic interest the efforts of the Jews to renew in Palestine the ties of their ancient homeland and to reestablish Jewish culture in a place where for centuries it flourished and whence it was carried to the far corners of the world." However, let me be clear, I do not buy into the oft-heard refrain that in order to solve our problems in the Middle East, we must first solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a complete red herring to claim that violence across the Middle East is a result of this conflict. I see some heads nodding, of course, and puzzled looks by the press, but let me elaborate. Several sources have looked at the levels of violence attributed to the various conflicts in the last half of the 20th century. It is interesting to note that since 1950, 2 years after the formation of Israel, there have been 67 conflicts throughout the world, resulting in 10,000 or more deaths. Number one on the list, at around 40 million, are the killings by the Red Chinese from 1949 to 1976. Last on the list is South Yemen Civil War, 1986, with 10,000 deaths. Now, where does the Arab-Israeli conflict rank on this list? 49th, 51,000 deaths. If one were to add the total number of deaths in all 67 conflicts since 1950, it would come to roughly 85 million. In other words, only 0.06% of the total number of deaths in all conflicts since 1950 are a result of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But there's even more telling statistic. Since Israel's founding in 1948, there have been approximately 11 million Muslims killed in violent conflicts, but only 35,000 of them were the result of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. 35,000 Muslim deaths from the Arab-Israeli conflict means that only 0.3% of the Muslim deaths from various conflicts have been a result of this conflict. In fact, over 90% of the 11 million Muslims killed since 1948 have been killed as a result of Muslim violence and conflicts. I raise these statistics here because I deeply believe that problems facing the West currently are the result of turmoil in the Middle East, and that has almost nothing, however, to do with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. As president, I would do what I could to try to create the kind of peace that I've previously outlined between Israelis and Palestinians. However, America needs to understand and acknowledge that peace in the Middle East is not predicated on peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The Middle East is certainly one of the most complicated regions in the world. I mean, really complicated. It is clear to me that the Obama administration has zero understanding of this region, and hence, due to the policies of our president and his State Department, the situation in the region has really gone from bad to worse. Let me give you a perfect example of how much President Obama misunderstands about this region and our allies and allegiances in the region. As the Arab Spring was unfolding, President Obama and Secretary Clinton saw this as a movement of democratic uprisings throughout the region. While I don't have the time to discuss how wrong this assumption was, I do want to highlight one of the misguided outcomes that our current administration precipitated. There has always been a power struggle in modern Egypt between the religious and secular factions. For decades, the United States backed Hosni Mubarak, a dictator, yes, but someone who also regularly waged war against the Islamic fundamentalists in his country. After the Arab Spring, President Obama and Secretary Clinton chose to back the government of Mohamed Morsi, a leader of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. In essence, the president decided to back a leader who represented the essence of Islamic fundamentalism. Well, we all know how that worked out. And in the end, thankfully, due to absolutely no efforts by the president, a more moderate anti-fundamentalist party got elected and took over power in Egypt. Now fast forward to last year during the Israeli-Gaza war with Hamas. As the war dragged on for almost 50 days, a war started by Hamas and its relentless firing of missiles into Israeli civilian population areas, President Obama and Secretary Kerry searched for an intermediary to negotiate a truce between Israel and Hamas. Now, you and I know full well that the most important party in not only negotiating a truce, but in helping to implement a truce is Egypt. Simply because Egypt shares a border with Gaza, and Egypt can help enforce a weapons embargo both on the land as well as in the seas. Also, trade and freedom of movement between Gaza and Egypt can only be enforced by Egypt themselves. But to whom did President Obama and Secretary Kerry turn to try to negotiate a truce? Turkey and Qatar. Besides the fact that Qatar is host to Hamas on a regular basis, and Turkey had prior and during the Gaza war called Israeli policies worse than those of Nazis, it just so happens that Egyptians see Turkey and Qatar as regional rivals and hold them in great disdain. So Obama and Kerry chose to alienate the most important partner for a truce by asking the exact wrong countries to get involved. My point in highlighting this example is again to say clearly what you already know. The world is complicated. The Middle East is even more complicated. And because it is so complicated, the next president of the United States has to adhere to a few key principles when deciding on foreign policy, particularly as it pertains to the Middle East. As president, here are three core principles that would formulate the foundation of my approach to these affairs. Principle number one, national security of the United States and her citizens is the single most consideration when determining foreign policy. Not running for president of the, or secretary of the, Secretary General of the United Nations, or president of the European Union, or any other position, but rather for president of the United States, and would ultimately bear the responsibility for defending our nation and her interests. Hence, all foreign policy decisions must be viewed through the lens of our national security interests. Many of you know that I am a man of devout faith. That faith teaches compassion, morals, and ethics. I believe that if a particular foreign policy can both maintain our national security interests while also being able to take the moral and compassionate high ground, then we should pursue it. However, when those two things are at odds, national security must trump other considerations. As you may have heard, I visited Syrian refugees in Jordan over the Thanksgiving weekend. My heart goes out to these people who simply want to live their lives. They want to send their kids to school, go to work, have dinner as a family, live without the shadow of war and terror hanging over them. It is the moral and compassionate instinct to open our arms and welcome them into our nation. However, we do not have the tools to properly vet every single one of these refugees. And from the standpoint of our national security, no U.S. president should adopt a policy that will likely allow terrorists to legally enter the United States via a refugee settlement program born out of our compassion. I believe the answer is to create safe havens for the refugees in Syria and to ensure their protection until the end of hostilities. And a lot of those safe havens exist already in places like Jordan. We, along with our regional allies, have the military power to keep them safe, and we have the resources available to provide shelter, clothing, food, and anything else necessary. This is a perfect example of how I would determine U.S. foreign policy in a way that puts our national security first, yet maintains a compassion and morality that we Americans are famous for. Principle two, we are currently facing a clash of civilizations between fundamentalist Islam and Western values. I view Israel as both our canary in the coal mine, meaning that as Israel goes, so goes Western civilization, but also as the tip of the spear in this clash. Israel is a democracy in the true sense of the word. Where else in the Middle East do women have the same rights as men? Where else in the Middle East does the government allow gay pride parades? in Israel, there are Arabs who serve as doctors, lawyers, teachers. There's even an Arab Supreme Court justice. Arab citizens in Israel have the same rights to medical care, Social Security, the ballot box, as any Jew does. Arab members of the Israeli parliament are even allowed to serve without taking an oath of allegiance. I dare say there are probably more women fighter pilots in Israel than there are women with driver's license in Saudi Arabia. Israel is a true symbol of a pluralistic democracy, and quite frankly, Israel is the only one that exists anywhere in the region. The United States must do everything to support Israel, embrace Israel, protect Israel, lift her up as an example to her neighbors as to what freedom really means and what that freedom can bring to a nation. If we as a country with a bond to Israel that goes back centuries do not make this a foreign policy priority, then I fear we may be dooming not just Israel but Western civilization itself. Harry Truman, a Democratic president, in opposition to his own Secretary of State, made sure the United States was the first nation to recognize the modern state of Israel on May 14, 1948. It took him all of 11 minutes after David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's establishment to say, "I had faith in Israel before it was established. I have faith in it now." I too have faith in the state of Israel and have faith that it is one of the everlasting bastions of Western civilization. Principle 3, a strong economy makes for a strong foreign policy. If we look back at the post-World War II era, it seems clear that several presidents, including John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, understood the simple principle. The basic logic is that by reducing the tax burden, one greatly stimulates the economy. And by stimulating the economy, one brings more revenue into the Treasury, even at a lower tax rate. More money into the Treasury means the government has more money to spend on the military. A larger military means the United States can project more power into the places that it needs to at the same time. A strong military is the best deterrent for war and the strongest insurer of peace. It will be my focus as President of the United States to stimulate the economy by reducing the tax burden on individuals and corporations, not just because I believe that it is a fair thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. And I believe that by having the ability to project American strength anywhere in the world, anytime we need it, we will keep Americans safer at home, our allies stronger abroad, and make the world a safer place overall. And I think we need to always keep in mind that America may never have become a place if it had not been for Chaim Solomon. He was a wealthy Jewish merchant, and Washington's army was completely exhausted in terms of funding, and Solomon gave all of his funds in order to save the United States Army. And some say, and of course no one knows for sure, but that's the reason that there's a Star of David on the back of a $1 bill. But the fact of the matter is, Judeo-Christian values are the thing that distinguishes us from so many other people in the world. And that's why I rail so strongly against giving away those values for the sake of political correctness. Now, I once heard an old Jewish proverb that says, even in a room of complete darkness, a single flame can illuminate the entire room. We are indeed in the middle of a clash of civilizations, a war against the forces of darkness. But in this war against those forces of darkness, there's not one, but two flames illuminating the room: the state of Israel and the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Watch your step. Thank you so much. Thank you.